Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most mysterious, harrowing, and sacred rituals in the entire Imperium of Man, soulbinding. On the surface, it's just a requirement, a checkpoint every sanctioned astropath must pass before they can serve the Imperium's endless communication network. But in truth, it's something far darker, something deeper, something almost unfathomable. Because soulbinding isn't just about enabling psychic transmission. It's a soul-shattering ordeal that links the fragile essence of a human being to the Emperor of Mankind himself. And not in some metaphorical religious sense. No, it's literal, real, measurable. The moment an astropath goes through this rite, they are forever changed, marked, scarred, and not just in body or mind. Their very soul becomes something else, something touched by the God Emperor. You see, for all the towering statues, hymns, and sermons, most citizens of the Imperium will never come remotely close to the Emperor. But astropaths? They feel him, see him, sometimes even speak to him, if you believe the more arcane reports. And that's where it starts to get truly terrifying, because that kind of proximity comes with a cost, always. And this isn't just about a toll in the abstract sense. The Emperor, for all his might and majesty, takes something from every single one of them. We tend to think of the Imperium as a cold machine of sacrifice, but rarely do we pause to examine the individual cogs being ground into fuel. What is the true nature of the soul binding? What does the Emperor claim in return for this sacred connection? Is it just the blindness, the pain, the burning visions of the warp? Or does he take something far more essential, something a soul can never reclaim? In this video, we're diving deep into this haunting ritual, peeling back the layers of dogma and fear to explore what truly happens during the soul binding. Not just how it works, but what it costs. And most importantly, what does the Emperor actually take from every astropath who undergoes this rite? The answer isn't simple. It's not just one thing, it's many. Some physical, some psychic, some far more abstract. But each loss tells us something, not only about the Emperor, but about the grim, brutal world that calls this ritual necessary. The soul-binding ritual isn't just a technical procedure or a box to tick on the way to becoming a sanctioned psyker. It's an event so intense, so profound, that it defies simple categorization. To truly grasp what it means, we need to go beyond the sterile lexicon of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and venture into the murky crossroads of metaphysics, faith, and survival. Because this isn't just about granting power or securing loyalty. It's about transforming a fragile, vulnerable human soul into something the warp itself can't immediately devour. At its core, soulbinding is a direct, psychic connection between a human psyker and the Emperor of Mankind. That sentence alone should make your skin crawl. Imagine being a mortal, staring into the mind of a being who burns with the force of a billion suns, ancient, divine, incomprehensible. The very act of brushing against his presence would vaporize any unprepared mind. And yet, during this ritual, the Emperor doesn't just acknowledge the psyker's existence, he touches them, leaves a mark, imprints something onto their essence that stays with them for the rest of their shortened, painful life. This rite is performed only on those psykers deemed worthy of becoming astropaths, individuals who will serve as the lifeblood of interstellar communication across the Imperium. Without them, humanity's endless war machine would collapse into isolated, blind planets doomed to die alone. So the ritual is essential. It's not optional. But that necessity doesn't make it any less horrifying. The process takes place deep within the secret vaults of Terra, within the Hall of the Astronomicon, or one of the most sacred chambers of the Scholastia Psychana. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of psykers are gathered in dark, echoing halls. They kneel in silence, often drugged or restrained, before powerful psyker adepts and imperial priests. The ritual begins with chanting, symbols burned into flesh and spirit, wards drawn in the air with blades, incense, and blood. It's theatrical, yes, but not for show. Every motion has a psychic resonance, every word a counterweight to the warp's unrelenting chaos. Then comes the moment no one can fully explain, the point at which the Emperor's mind touches theirs. No one alive today, not even the most senior members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, truly understands how this occurs. Is it the Emperor acting directly? Or is it some lingering mechanism from the Golden Age, a relic ritual designed when the Emperor still walked among mortals. Some fans believe it's more of an echo than a direct act, a psychic projection burned into the webway machinery beneath the throne. Others swear that it is him, still awake and watching, choosing whom to bless and whom to destroy. Whatever the truth, the effect is always the same, a soul transformed. Some say the Emperor binds them by fusing a part of his light into their essence. Others claim he simply brands them, leaving a scar that resonates through the immaterium, warning demons to stay away. There's even a theory, more whispered than spoken, that the Emperor feeds off this moment, drawing psychic nourishment from each binding like a dying god feeding from the faithful. I don't fully buy into that, but you can't deny it's a chilling thought. And in this universe, the line between savior and parasite is often paper thin. What we do know is that after the ritual, something fundamental has changed. The Astropath's connection to the warp becomes cleaner, sharper, safer. They can now navigate its currents and transmit messages across light years without being instantly torn apart by the creatures that lurk in the shadows. The ritual shields them, not perfectly, not forever, but enough to function. And considering the fate of unbound psykers, that shielding is a precious, precious gift. But let's not romanticize it. Soulbinding isn't about love or mercy. It's survival at its most brutal. It's the Imperium saying, yes, you'll suffer. Yes, this will burn you to your core, but you'll be useful, you'll serve. There's no nobility in it, only necessity. And yet there's also something awe-inspiring here. Because whether you see the Emperor as a god or a monster, or both, the fact remains, through soulbinding, he touches individual human beings, one by one. That act alone gives the ritual a weight, unlike anything else in the Imperium. These aren't just psykers anymore, they're chosen, marked, scarred by divinity. And whether that scar is a gift or a curse, well, that's where things start to get complicated. There's a reason most people in the Imperium fear psykers. And no, it's not just because they can melt your brain with a thought or summon warp-spawn nightmares into reality. Though, sure, that doesn't help. It's because deep down, everyone senses that psykers have seen something the rest of us were never meant to see. Their minds have been cracked open to the raw essence of the immaterium. And even after all the rites and protections, that exposure changes them. Nowhere is that more painfully clear than in the aftermath of soulbinding. When a psyker undergoes this ritual, their mind doesn't just shift, it fractures. Not in the obvious sense, not like a mirror shattering in one clean break. It's more insidious than that. The binding sears the warp out of control, wrapping a psychic firewall around their soul. But the process itself leaves scars, echoes, imprints. Afterward, most astropaths describe a permanent sensation of something, someone, being inside their heads. Sometimes it's the Emperor. Sometimes it's something worse, but it never, ever goes away. One of the most consistent reports from soulbound astropaths is the presence of voices. Not just auditory hallucinations, but full-blown psychic dialogues. Some describe them as whispers, distant and unintelligible, like a transmission just out of frequency. Others claim the voices speak directly, clearly, often offering guidance or condemnation. There's a haunting theory among fans that these aren't delusions at all, but residual traces of the Emperor himself. Or worse, fragments of other astropaths who didn't survive the ritual, but were somehow absorbed into the psychic process. Like their thoughts were etched into the ritual space and now echo through every subsequent mind that passes through it. And then there are the visions. Almost all astropaths at some point begin experiencing what many describe as soul flashbacks. Intense, often painful episodes where time and space seem to collapse. One second they're in a transmission chamber, the next they're reliving some distant battle, a death, a scream that was never theirs. Some see burning angels, others spirals of impossible geometry. A few even claim to have seen the Emperor's face, though no two accounts ever match. That kind of inconsistency should tell you something. It's not reality they're seeing, it's truth in its rawest, most incomprehensible form. And no human mind can hold on to that for long without warping under the weight. This is where the real psychological toll sets in. Imagine never knowing if your thoughts are your own. Imagine trying to sleep while feeling the gaze of a god, or something pretending to be a god, lingering behind your eyes. Paranoia, dissociation, Personality fragmentation and full-blown schizoaffective episodes are terrifyingly common. The Imperium does what it always does, slaps on a seal of approval, calls it sanctioned madness, and pushes these people right back into duty. But the truth is, most of them are breaking, slowly and quietly. They just happen to be doing it in service to something greater. There are entire sanctuaries on Terra and Cadia. Well, we're on Cadia, dedicated to tending to astropaths who've lost their grip. The official term is psychic exhaustion, but the adepts call it what it really is: soul burn. It's when the pressure of the Emperor's touch, the constant hum of warp static, and the sheer loneliness of their psychic burden finally tears through the last defenses of the mind. When that happens, some become catatonic. Others start screaming truths no one wants to hear. A few go rogue, driven by hallucinations of false prophecy. And those are the ones who get quietly eliminated, their existence scrubbed from records to preserve the illusion of control. It's easy to look at this from a distance and say, well, that's the price of survival. But imagine being that person. Imagine being 16 years old, dragged from your Hive City slum because your mind glowed a little too brightly. You're told you'll serve the Emperor, that you're chosen, that your gift is sacred. And then, after a ritual you barely understand, you wake up blind, tormented by alien voices, and unable to tell if the thoughts in your head are yours or someone else's. That's not just trauma, it's transformation. And not always for the better. Some fans theorize that the Emperor doesn't just mark these psykers, but reprograms them. That the mental breakdown isn't a side effect, it's the point. By breaking them down and rebuilding them around a psychic kernel of his will, he ensures loyalty. He doesn't need to mind control them, he just becomes a part of them. Creepy? Definitely. But in a galaxy where daemons can whisper lies directly into your dreams, maybe it's the only way to keep these fragile conduits from falling apart entirely. Or worse, turning traitor. There's also a fascinating argument in the community that this mental suffering creates a kind of mystical empathy. That astropaths, despite their torment, become more human in a strange way. They feel everything, joy, pain, sorrow, from across the stars. They live in a constant storm of psychic impressions, and yet they keep transmitting. They endure. Maybe that's what the Emperor really wanted, not just loyal servants, but emotional anchors, souls so raw and exposed that they carry the weight of humanity with every message they send. But even if that's true, even if there's beauty in the madness, it doesn't change the fact that soul-binding tears the mind apart. The ritual might save their souls from being eaten by daemons, but it often costs them their sanity. And that's a trade no one should have to make lightly. It's hard to talk about the soul-binding without acknowledging the brutal toll it takes on the body. Everyone knows about the psychic agony, the voices, the fractured minds, but far fewer understand what actually happens physically to those who go through it. And honestly, that's because the results are often too horrific, too disfiguring, too unnatural to be widely discussed. Even within the Imperium, where suffering is currency and martyrdom is a job description, the aftermath of soul-binding stands out as something uniquely grotesque. The most well-known side effect, of course, is blindness. Almost every astropath loses their sight during the ritual. It's not symbolic, it's not poetic, it's violent. The energy released when the Emperor's presence sears through their soul often burns out their optic nerves entirely, sometimes even melting the eyes in their sockets. Some survivors report feeling as if molten fire was poured directly into their skulls. Others wake up to find their eyes have simply turned to dust. There are even rumors, half-whispers from rogue archivists on Terra, that a few astropaths scream their eyes out during the ritual, clawing at their faces in uncontrollable agony as the warp energy floods their nerves. But here's the thing. Blindness is just the beginning. Many astropaths suffer full-body trauma during the soul-binding. Some emerge with skin blackened as if from a warp-borne radiation burn. Others lose their hair permanently, teeth fall out, fingernails split down to the bone. In some cases, their veins darken visibly, a sign of residual psychic scorching that never truly fades. You'll sometimes see senior astropaths wrapped head to toe in ceremonial robes, and it's not just about tradition or reverence, it's to hide what's left of them. There are reports, real or at least consistent enough to be believed, of astropaths who develop seizures during transmission, limbs convulsing uncontrollably as their nervous system tries to process the overwhelming psychic feedback. A few are paralyzed entirely after soulbinding, not because of spinal trauma, but because their bodies simply shut down, as if the Emperor's touch overwhelmed every organic circuit at once. Then there are the burns, and these are especially terrifying. They're not always external. Some astropaths are burned from the inside. Autopsy records, leaked from the Ordo Hereticus archives if you trust those kinds of sources, show internal organs fused together, lungs scarred as if by centuries of toxin exposure, and brain tissue that looks like it's been dipped in acid. The theory among some fans is that the Emperor's presence, so overwhelming in its purity and power, cleanses impurities through sheer force, the way a star purifies a planet by obliterating it. Of course, there are stranger cases too. There always are. A handful of astropaths seem to change in ways that don't even make anatomical sense. One supposedly grew a second heart after the ritual. Another had their skin begin to shimmer faintly, reflecting light like polished glass. There's a case buried deep in the Librarius archives of an astropath whose blood turned metallic, literally magnetic, drawn towards sacred relics and purity seals. Fan theories abound here. Some say these are signs of divine favor, the Emperor's grace given physical form. Others argue it's a kind of warp mutation that just happens to align with imperial symbolism. I've even heard the idea floated that the Emperor doesn't just mark the soul, he rebuilds the flesh, reshaping it to better channel his will. The scariest part? No two bindings are ever quite the same. The ritual is standardized in form, yes, chants, seals, incantations, but the outcome is wildly unpredictable. Some come out nearly untouched, save for the blindness. Others are wrecked beyond recognition. It's almost as if the Emperor himself chooses what price each soul must pay. Or maybe the soul decides. Maybe it's not about physical resilience at all, but about how much guilt, fear, or trauma a person carries into the chamber. Some fans believe the ritual doesn't just burn the body, it manifests your sins. That what you suffer is what you've hidden. That theory, it sticks with you. There's one more aspect that always rattles me, the way astropaths age after soulbinding. Not always immediately, but over time they tend to decay faster. Their bodies wear out years before they should. Joints stiffen, organs fail, even if their minds remain relatively intact. It's like their bodies know they're on borrowed time. Like whatever happened in that ritual chamber set an internal timer, and once it starts ticking, there's no slowing it down. It's not a clean death, either. Many astropaths die coughing blood, writhing from neural feedback, or worse, bursting into warp fire mid-transmission when their shields finally fail. But even with all that, they choose this, or at least, they accept it. Because they believe, or are made to believe, that their suffering means something. That their broken bodies are a shield between the Imperium and madness. And maybe that's true. Maybe every seared nerve, every blind eye, is a step forward for humanity in a war it can't afford to lose. Still, it haunts me. The idea that service to the Emperor comes not just at the cost of mind and soul, but at the cost of everything you are, physically. That the very thing meant to elevate you, to make you useful, holy, pure, is also what ensures you'll never be whole again. That's not just devotion. That's sacrifice on a scale we rarely dare to speak about. Here's where things start to get unsettling. Because beyond the physical wounds, beyond the fractured minds and burning nerves, there's something else that soulbinding takes. Something more elusive, more sacred, and infinitely harder to measure. We're talking about the soul, not metaphorically, not poetically, the actual soul. There's a growing number of fans who believe, genuinely and deeply, that the Emperor doesn't just touch the soul of every astropath, he claims a piece of it. And not in some abstract religious way. They mean it quite literally. This isn't easy to talk about because the Imperium isn't exactly open about this kind of metaphysical speculation. But if you dig through the deeper layers of lore, especially the more esoteric writings from the Scholastica Psychana or the Ordo Astra Telepathica, there are hints, strange reports, inconsistencies in psychic signatures, a pattern of spiritual thinning noted in long-serving astropaths. It's like something essential is missing, drained, extracted, taken during the ritual and never given back, not destroyed, transferred. The theory goes like this. The Emperor, even as a near-dead husk on the Golden Throne, requires sustenance. Not just physical sacrifices like the daily tithe of psykers consumed to fuel the Astronomicon. We all know about that. This is something else. This is about spiritual fuel. The soul-binding ritual, some believe, is a more refined method of taking that energy without outright annihilating the psyker. Instead of burning them to ash, the Emperor reaches in and slices off a sliver of their soul. Just enough to bind, just enough to feed, just enough to mark them forever. Think about what that means. These aren't just initiations or psychic inoculations. They're sacrifices. Every astropath walks out of that chamber with less of themselves than they entered with. Some fan interpretations even call them living reliquaries, vessels that carry not only the Emperor's blessing but a fragment of themselves they'll never recover. Their joy becomes dimmer, their dreams muted. Some report feeling permanently hollow, as though part of their inner flame was snuffed out in the moment of contact. And the worst part? It's not always immediate. Some astropaths report a slow spiritual decay after soul binding. They describe it like a slow leak in their essence, a quiet siphoning that continues long after the ritual is done. They feel lighter, but not in a good way. Diminished. One theory suggests that the Emperor leaves a tether in their soul, an unseeable link through which he continues to draw power across the years. Like they've become psychic batteries, slowly being drained in service to something too vast to resist. Others argue the exact opposite, that what's taken isn't power but identity. That the soul fragment absorbed by the Emperor isn't just energy, but the core of who that person was. Their creativity, their passion, their moral compass. Stripped away to make them more obedient, more compliant, more useful. That would explain why many astropaths begin to act with an eerie detachment after the ritual. Not robotic, not emotionless, but removed, like someone watching their own life unfold from a distance. Of course, not everyone sees this as a theft. Some interpret it as a form of holy offering. In certain imperial cults, soul binding is treated as a kind of communion, a ritual gift where the astropath willingly gives a part of themselves to the master of mankind. They see it as an honor, proof of divine service. These sects even craft hymns about it, praising the gift of flame that binds them to the light of Terra. But let's be honest, that framing only softens the horror, because no matter how beautifully you dress it up, something is taken. Whether by choice or by force, the cost is real. There's a line in one of the forbidden fragments of the Lectitio Divinitatis, one that rarely survives imperial censorship. It says, "To serve the Emperor is to offer not just your life, but your eternity." That line haunts me, because what if it's not just poetic exaggeration? What if, in some hidden vault beneath the Golden Throne, there's a record of every astropath's soul, stored like data in a machine, reduced to pure essence and consumed drop by drop? There's even a fringe theory, wild and heretical, that the Emperor is building something. That each soul fragment taken from an astropath is a piece of a larger puzzle, a mosaic of consciousness designed to preserve humanity's essence in the warp. That maybe he's not just taking for the sake of survival, but constructing some spiritual weapon or sanctuary. I don't know. It sounds crazy, but in a galaxy this twisted, sometimes the insane theories are the ones that turn out to be real. But here's what I do know. Every astropath who undergoes soul binding comes back changed. Not just scarred, not just blinded, but less. And they never talk about it. Not really. Not because they're forbidden to, but because most of them can't. They don't have the words anymore. It's like the piece that was taken held the ability to describe what it was. You can see it in their eyes, well, the empty sockets where their eyes used to be. That look of quiet absence, that silence that stretches just a little too long. So yeah, maybe it's a gift, maybe it's a sacrifice, maybe it's both. But what I believe deep down is that soul binding doesn't just mark astropaths, it consumes them. Not all at once, not visibly, but piece by piece, soul by soul. And whatever the Emperor takes from them, he never gives it back. There's something almost religious about the way astropaths are spoken of in the deeper layers of imperial dogma. Not just as psykers or servants, but as vessels, living icons bearing the Emperor's mark. And I don't mean that figuratively. One of the strangest and most sacred beliefs held by many of the Imperium's inner cults is that during the soul binding, the Emperor doesn't just take from the Astropath, he leaves something behind. A trace, a spark, a spiritual brand that's burned so deep into their essence it reshapes who they are forever. It's often described in terms that sound suspiciously like old Terran religious rituals. Some cults call it the second baptism. Others liken it to a sacred branding, a purification of the soul by fire. The more orthodox factions even believe it's a literal rewriting of the soul's code, like the Emperor's will is etched into their being at the moment of contact, hardwired into them like a holy script across their psychic core. They're no longer just psykers, they're his. This is where the whole concept of the Emperor's touch becomes something much more than a metaphor. According to some Adeptus Ministorum texts, particularly those not widely circulated, Astropaths are considered to be sanctified through suffering. Their agony isn't a byproduct of the ritual, it's the medium through which divine presence is impressed upon them. Pain becomes the ink, the soul the parchment, and once that mark is made, it's irreversible. You hear it in how other imperial citizens talk about Astropaths too. There's fear, sure, there always is with psykers, but also this strange reverent distance, like they're half human, half saint, touched by something no one else can comprehend. It's not about their power. Plenty of psykers are powerful. It's about this unseen presence they carry, this sense that they've been visited by something greater, and they'll never be alone again. Some astropaths say they can feel it for the rest of their lives, this quiet hum in the back of their thoughts, like a heartbeat that isn't theirs. There's one particularly fascinating theory that circulates in more arcane circles, one that suggests the Emperor doesn't just leave a mark, but a directive. A kind of psychic subroutine embedded deep in the astropath's mind. It doesn't control them, not directly, but it influences, guides. Some claim this is how the Emperor ensures loyalty without mind control. Others believe it's a fragment of his own will, distributed like pieces of a god's mind scattered across thousands of psykers. If that's true, then every astropath is carrying a splinter of divinity inside them, whether they know it or not. But it's not always gentle. Some astropaths describe the experience as being flayed open and stitched back together with light. They speak of dreams that aren't theirs, memories that echo with the weight of ancient sorrow, and a persistent sense that they are never truly alone inside their own minds. It's not invasive, exactly. It's more like standing beside a silent observer who never blinks. A lot of people think that would be comforting. But the idea of being watched every moment of your life, even in your thoughts, that's not comfort, that's pressure. That's presence in its most suffocating form. Still, there's no denying that some astropaths emerge from soulbinding stronger. Not in the traditional muscular sense, but spiritually. It's like their faith gets welded into something unbreakable. They don't question the Emperor's will, not because they're afraid, but because they've felt it. There's no room for doubt when you've been scorched by divinity. It's one thing to believe in a god, it's another thing entirely to carry his fingerprints on your soul. Some radical theologians take this even further. They claim that astropaths aren't just marked, they're transfigured. That through soul binding, they become a different kind of being. Still human in flesh, yes, but altered in spirit, elevated, tethered forever to the Astronomicon, resonating with the psychic pulse of the Emperor's mind like tuning forks of the divine. These theorists argue that the ritual is less about enabling transmission and more about creating beacons, points of light in the warp that remind humanity of the Emperor's presence, even in its darkest corners. It's a poetic idea, but also a haunting one, because if that's true, then every astropath is more than just a message carrier. They're a signal, a monument, a walking shrine built from agony and soul fire. And the Emperor doesn't just leave his will behind, he leaves himself, in fragments, in whispers, in imprints burned too deep to fade. I'll admit, there's a part of me that finds that beautiful. The idea that amidst all the cruelty and horror, there's this quiet moment of transcendence. A mortal soul, naked before a god and reshaped in that divine image. But then I think about the price. The blindness, the voices, the fading sense of self. And I wonder if the mark the Emperor leaves is really a gift, or just another chain, gilded with holy symbols and lit by the fire of sacrifice. Whatever the truth is, the one thing we can say for sure is this: No one walks away from soulbinding unchanged. The Emperor leaves his trace, not in blood or flame, but in the essence of what makes a person who they are. A psychic signature, a spiritual fingerprint, an invisible scar. And whether you see it as a blessing, a curse, or both, it stays with them. Always. This is where things get uncomfortable, even for the most diehard loyalists. We've talked about the pain, the sacrifice, the spiritual mark left behind. But there's a deeper, darker question that lingers beneath it all. One that even the ecclesiarchy rarely dares to ask aloud. After soul binding, are astropaths still themselves? Or is there something embedded in their minds, some kind of psychic anchor, that ensures they can never truly think freely again? You hear it whispered among rogue scholars and radical psykers. The idea that the Emperor doesn't just leave a trace on the soul, but a program. Not like a data file or a simple command, but something more fundamental, a rewiring, a restructuring of thoughts and instincts so subtle, so profound, that the astropath never realizes it's even happened. To the outside world they seem normal, damaged, sure, but functional, still capable of conversation, still aware of who they were. But deep down at the core of their psyche, something else has taken root. Some fans refer to this as the golden seed theory, the belief that during the moment of soul binding, the Emperor implants a psychic kernel of his will. Not as a possession, not as domination, but as a failsafe. A hard-coded impulse that prevents the astropath from ever turning against him, even in their darkest, most desperate moments. You can think of it like a safety circuit, or maybe a firewall. Not complete control, but a restriction. A barrier that no rebellious thought can cross. There's a lot of debate about whether this is ethical or even real. But if you look at the way astropaths behave, especially the older ones, there's something off about their loyalty. It's not fanatical, it's not even passionate. It's quiet, automatic. Like a habit so deeply ingrained it stopped being conscious. They refer to the Emperor not just with reverence, but with this eerie finality, like it's impossible to even imagine questioning him. Not because they fear punishment, but because the thought doesn't even form. That's what scares me the most. Not zealotry, but absence of doubt. And this isn't just anecdotal. In some hidden records from the Scholastia Psychana, ones only the highest-ranking depths have access to, there are references to something called cognitive alignment conditioning. The documents are vague, full of bureaucratic obfuscation, but the implication is clear. Soul binding isn't just about linking the psyker to the astronomicon. It's about reconditioning their mind, burning away the dangerous parts, installing a more acceptable framework. Think of it like psychic formatting, a wipe and rewrite. The person who enters the ritual isn't the same as the one who leaves, not just spiritually or emotionally, but fundamentally. Their motivations shift, their sense of self warps just enough to guarantee obedience. That's where the anchor idea comes in. The theory that the Emperor leaves behind not just a presence, but a tether. Something unbreakable. Something that pulls every thought, every instinct back toward him. One of the more unsettling comparisons I've come across is to ancient Terran programming methods, specifically subroutines buried inside AIs to prevent rebellion. We all know what happened with abominable intelligences, how the Men of Iron turned on their creators. So maybe this is the Emperor's answer to that same problem, but applied to humans. Insert a piece of yourself into every asset. Make them incapable of betrayal, not through fear, but through design. Of course, not everyone buys into this. Some argue that what we interpret as control is actually just reverence, that astropaths are loyal because they chose to be, that the act of soul binding is so overwhelming, so intimate, that it simply leaves no room for doubt. It's not programming, it's spiritual transformation. A communion so deep that it changes what you want, not what you're allowed to want. But then again, is there really a difference? There's a haunting story I once read in an old fan archive. It was about an astropath who began to question the Imperium after witnessing a massacre ordered by an inquisitor. She tried to resist, tried to break protocol, and send a warning to a rebel planet. But every time she tried to form the message, her thoughts unraveled. Her hand froze, her mind filled with static. She described it as hitting a wall made of light, beautiful, blinding, and completely impassable. She died shortly after, during a supposedly routine transmission. Officially, it was psychic overload. But the fan who posted the story called it something else. Auto-nullification. The Emperor's failsafe activating. Even if it's just a myth, the idea sticks with you. What if freedom for an astropath is an illusion? What if the binding isn't just protective, it's possessive? There's one more layer to this, and it's the part that gives me chills. Some believe that the Emperor doesn't do this for security. He does it out of fear. That even now, locked in the Golden Throne, barely alive, he remembers the heresy, the betrayals, the lies, and he's decided, never again. No more variables, no more broken trust, only tools, only minds sculpted to be safe, loyal, predictable. That's not faith, that's paranoia, and maybe it's justified, but it doesn't make it any less tragic. So the question remains, are astropaths free? I don't know. Maybe some are. Maybe the Emperor only steps in when he senses danger. Or maybe every thought they have, every choice they make, is shaped by a voice that whispers not in words, but in instinct. A tether that's always pulling, always guiding, and they'll never even know it's there. Once the ritual is over, once the screaming fades and the soul stops trembling, the astropath steps back into the light, if you can call it that, utterly changed. Not just in body or mind, but in purpose. From that point on, their life is no longer their own. It's been redirected, like a river dammed and sent down a narrow, predetermined channel. They become a conduit, a beacon, a voice hurled across the stars. And whether they see that role as a divine calling or a psychic prison, well, that depends on who you ask. The moment an astropath survives the soul binding, they're no longer considered a person in the traditional sense. Not by the Imperium, and sometimes not even by themselves. They're a function, a living instrument woven into the vast machinery of the Imperium's communication network. Billions of worlds rely on them to send astropathic messages, which are the only lifeline between systems in the warp-choked void. No ships would coordinate, no reinforcements would arrive, no threats would be known in time to be countered. It's all held together by these blind, broken psykers whispering through the madness. But here's the part that always gets to me. Most astropaths understand this. They know their role. They know their worth. And they accept it with this eerie sense of calm, like their personal desires were scrubbed away along with everything else. Their duty becomes everything. Some truly believe they've been chosen by the Emperor to carry out his will. Others believe they're being punished, and this endless cycle of message and response is their penance. Either way, they serve. Because there's nothing else left. Some treat it like a monastic life. They live in silence for weeks at a time, meditating in dark chambers, surrounded by psychic wards and holy symbols. You'll find astropathic choirs chanting together in harmony, not for aesthetics, but to anchor each other's minds. It helps them stay stable, connected, less prone to the psychic drift that can take hold after too much time spent deep in the immaterium. In a way, it's beautiful, this brotherhood of broken souls, huddled around the flickering flame of duty, singing the galaxy into coherence. Others, though, see it differently. There are plenty of accounts of astropaths who view their role not as sacred, but as enslaved. One of the more heartbreaking stories I've come across was about an astropath stationed aboard a rogue trader vessel. She served for 23 years, guiding the ship through dangerous warp currents and transmitting desperate messages from one lawless world to another. When she finally broke, psychically and emotionally, she didn't cry out in rage or fear. She just whispered, "I forgot who I was supposed to be." That line stuck with me. It wasn't the horror of the job that broke her. It was the erasure of identity. This is the reality of their mission, total self-erasure in service of the whole. The Imperium calls it noble, necessary, holy. But is it? The astropath doesn't get to choose where they're stationed, who they serve, or what kind of messages they're forced to channel. They can't say no to a request. They can't refuse to speak a lie, even if they know the order they're transmitting will lead to the extermination of an entire planet. Their hands are tied, their voice leased out. They are prisoners in golden robes. That's not to say all astropaths are miserable. Some do find purpose in the work. There are recorded instances where entire planets were saved because of an astropath's courage. Times when, even as their mind cracked under pressure, they held on long enough to send a warning, to call for aid. And when that happens, they're celebrated, honored, sometimes even canonized as saints of Ox. But most of the time, No one even remembers their names. Their service is invisible, their deaths unceremonious. There's a popular fan theory that astropaths aren't just serving the Imperium, they're holding back the warp itself. That every message they send, every connection they maintain, is like driving a psychic nail into the immaterium, pinning it in place just long enough for civilization to keep moving. It's a grand, mythic idea. And I want to believe it. I want to think their suffering has that kind of impact. But the truth is probably simpler and sadder. They serve because there's no alternative. Because survival requires sacrifice, and astropaths were built to be sacrificed slowly. And yet, despite everything, many of them hold their heads high. Even without eyes, even without peace, even with their thoughts flickering like dying candles, they choose to keep transmitting, to keep speaking, to keep singing into the dark. Maybe that's what really makes them remarkable. Not the power, not the sacrifice, but the fact that even after all they've lost, they still believe their voice matters, that someone, somewhere, is listening. That's not just a job. That's not even duty. That's faith. And in a galaxy this broken, maybe that's the most powerful force left. There's this strange, haunting reverence the Imperium has for suffering. It's not just something to be endured, it's something to be exalted. And nowhere is that more evident than in how the ecclesiarchy and imperial cults view astropaths. They're not just psykers, they're not even just servants, they're martyrs. Living proof that agony can be holy. That pain, when inflicted in the Emperor's name, isn't a curse, it's a form of communion. It's hard to wrap your head around at first. We're used to thinking of faith as something warm, something that brings comfort. But in the Imperium, faith is forged through fire. It's sharpened by suffering. And astropaths, they embody that philosophy in a way almost no one else does. Every inch of their bodies, every flicker of their thoughts carries the scars of sacrifice. They're blind, burned, fragmented, and yet they still serve. That alone turns them into walking symbols of imperial resilience, like saints who never died but were instead broken slowly into holiness. In some shrine worlds, there are entire murals dedicated to the suffering of astropaths. I've seen depictions of soulbinding painted like religious epics, blind psykers kneeling in a storm of light, their skin peeling from their bones, eyes erupting into flames, while the Emperor looms above them like a golden sun. It's graphic, yes, but it's meant to be. It's a kind of visual gospel. The message is simple. This is what faith looks like. Not peace, not serenity, but pain willingly embraced, and it goes deeper than art. There are sermons, real, codified ecclesiarchy sermons, that describe astropathic suffering as a holy purification. Their blindness is a second sight, their agony a refining fire. One of the more disturbing ones I came across called their daily transmissions whispers of sanctified blood. It sounds poetic, even beautiful, until you realize what it actually means. They're glorifying the constant, grinding torment these psykers endure just to keep the Imperium functioning. But here's the wild thing. A lot of astropaths believe this. Or at least, they've internalized it. I've read memoir fragments, rare, heavily redacted documents where astropaths describe their pain not as suffering, but as service. One wrote, "Each scream that leaves my lips is a hymn to his glory. Each fracture in my soul is a window through which his light shines brighter." That line gutted me, not just because of what it says, but because of what it implies. That this person's entire self-worth had been redefined around how much they could endure. And yeah, there are clear religious parallels here, especially when you compare it to old Terran systems of belief. There were ancient sects that believed enlightenment could only be achieved through suffering, that the body had to be punished for the soul to ascend. Flagellants, mystics, saints who starved themselves, walked on coals, spent decades in isolation, all in pursuit of some divine truth. It's eerie how closely that mindset echoes in the Imperium. Only now, it's been systematized, weaponized, baked into the very structure of society. The soul binding itself is viewed almost like a sacrament. Not just a ritual of necessity, but a rite of passage into sanctified torment. Some cults call it the burning baptism. Others refer to astropaths as those whom the Emperor has personally crucified. That's the level of reverence we're talking about. And it's not just about honoring them. It's about learning from them. Their pain becomes a kind of scripture. Every scar, every tremor is another verse in the living gospel of sacrifice. There's a disturbing theory among some fringe theologians that the emperor wants this kind of suffering, not because he's cruel, but because it reflects his own. That by mirroring his eternal pain on the golden throne, astropaths draw closer to him. They suffer, and in doing so they share in his burden. It's a twisted kind of empathy, like being flayed alongside a god. Of course, not everyone buys into that. Some see it as pure manipulation, that the Imperium glorifies astropathic pain not out of respect, but to justify its exploitation. After all, if you tell someone their suffering is wholly long enough, they stop fighting it. They embrace it. And suddenly, you've got a population of psykers who never ask for rest, never resist their role, never think of themselves as victims. Just saints in training, inching closer to oblivion. Still, whether you see it as divine truth or institutional brainwashing, the effect is undeniable. Astropaths are symbols. They're reminders that faith in the Imperium isn't about comfort, it's about endurance. Not about mercy, but about meaning forged through torment. And that's why they're revered. Not despite their pain, but because of it. There's this one shrine I heard about, deep in the catacombs of Terra, where they keep relics of dead astropaths. Robes stiff with blood, burned bone fragments sealed in crystal, even voice recordings of their final transmissions. Pilgrims go there not to mourn, but to be inspired, to weep, to believe. Because in a galaxy without hope, pain becomes the only thing left that feels real. And astropaths, in all their blind, broken glory, are the Imperium's bleeding candles in the dark. One of the questions I keep seeing, on forums, in obscure data vaults, even whispered in game shop corners, is this. Why are astropaths the ones who go through soulbinding and not every psyker in the Imperium? It's a good question, and the answer says a lot about how the Imperium views its own tools, especially the psychic ones. Because let's be real, psykers aren't rare. They're everywhere, in every corner of the galaxy, popping up like warped weeds. But only a very specific group is ever subjected to this terrifying, soul-scorching ritual. And that group is astropaths. The first thing that sets astropaths apart is their function. Most psykers are weapons, shock troops, utility tools. They fight, kill, defend, or destroy. Sanctioned battle psykers, Primaris psykers in the Guard, even librarians in the Astartes, they all serve a combat purpose. Their psychic talents are meant to be directed outward, explosively and violently. But astropaths, they're not about destruction. They're about connection. Their entire existence is built around the idea of linking distant points in the galaxy, threading psychic messages through the warp across impossible distances, often through unimaginable horrors. That communication role requires more than just raw psychic power. It demands control, precision, stability, and that's exactly what the soulbinding is supposed to enforce. It isn't just a protective rite, it's a form of psychic conditioning. A way to lock their minds into a fixed frequency, tuning them to the Astronomicon and filtering out the countless screaming voices of the Immaterium. Without it, they'd be dead within days, or worse, possessed, corrupted, or driven mad beyond use. Other psykers don't need that kind of stability. In fact, instability is often baked into their design. You don't need a battle psyker to be serene. You need them to be dangerous, unpredictable, and honestly, disposable. If a guardsman psyker burns out during a warp surge or explodes mid-campaign, it's a tragedy, but a manageable one. You replace them, you move on. But if an astropath loses control mid-transmission, that could doom entire systems. Imagine the catastrophic effects of a false message about an incoming hive fleet or a false distress call from Segmentum Solar. That's the level of trust being placed in every soulbound psyker. That's why the ritual is necessary. It's also worth mentioning how soulbinding essentially rewires the psyker's warp resonance. It's like carving a specific pathway through their soul that connects directly to the Emperor's light. That's not useful for everyone. A librarian wouldn't benefit from being psychically shackled to the Astronomicon. It might actually make them worse in battle, slower, too focused on signal purity instead of adaptive combat instincts. But for an astropath, that binding is the weapon. That narrow path is their whole reason for existing. There's also the matter of identity. Most sanctioned psykers, no matter how traumatized they are, retain some sense of individuality. They're allowed to have names, personalities, even ambitions, so long as they serve. But astropaths, after the binding, many of them shed all that. It's not enforced officially, but culturally, spiritually, it just dissolves. They're referred to by rank, by function. Not Kale, the talented psyker, but Astropath Transcendent Kale. It's subtle, but it reflects a deeper transformation. They're not just sanctioned, they're claimed. I've heard fans describe the difference like this. Regular psykers are tools the Imperium uses. Astropaths are tools the Emperor himself has touched. That might sound poetic, but it tracks. When you undergo soulbinding, you're not just being approved for duty. You're being psychically burned into the latticework of the Emperor's will. That's a level of intimacy no other psyker ever reaches. Not even the most powerful ones. Not even Grey Knights. And yet, that intimacy comes with a cost. Most psykers don't lose their eyes. Most don't suffer from endless echoing soul ache. They don't live their days huddled in dark towers, whispering code through screaming warp currents, while their flesh rots away. Soulbinding isn't a reward. It's a sentence. And in many ways it marks astropaths as the most enslaved psykers in the entire Imperium. There's this fringe theory that soulbinding is less about safety and more about control. That the Emperor, knowing how vital astropaths are to the Imperium's survival, decided to impose a deeper level of ownership over them. A permanent tether. A brand that ensures loyalty not through fear, but through metaphysical integration. Other psykers can run, rebel, turn traitor, but a soulbound astropath, they're psychically anchored to the throne itself. There's no escape. No betrayal. Only the slow, dutiful decay of endless service. And maybe that's why so few others are subjected to the ritual, because the Imperium doesn't need every psyker to be that bound, that tamed. It only needs its most vital communicators, the voices that stitch the stars together, to be utterly and irrevocably claimed. Every astropath is a living wire in the galaxy's nervous system, and you don't want your nervous system going rogue. So yeah, that's the difference. It's not just about power levels or specialties, it's about role, trust, proximity. Soulbinding isn't a badge of honor, it's a sign that you've been fused to something larger than yourself and that you'll never be separate from it again. Other psykers get to burn brightly for a while and vanish, but astropaths, they endure. Silently, blindly, bound forever to a god who no longer speaks, but always listens. By this point, we've talked so much about what the Emperor takes from astropaths, their sight, their minds, pieces of their soul, that it's easy to fall into the trap of seeing him as this distant, uncaring god who only consumes. And yeah, on the surface, that's a pretty reasonable conclusion. The soulbinding is brutal. It scars, breaks, and often destroys. But what if there's more to it than just sacrifice? What if this ritual isn't just about loss, but also about transformation? What if the Emperor doesn't just take? What if he also gives? It's a hard thing to accept, especially when you see what's left of many astropaths after their binding. They're shadows of their former selves, right? Hollowed out, trembling, whispering things that don't always make sense. But dig deeper, and you start to notice something strange. They're not just broken, they're anchored. They have this presence, this stillness that doesn't feel natural. It's like standing next to a storm, held in check by pure force of will. You look into the empty sockets of an astropath, and it hits you. Something's still in there. Something vast. Something impossible. That's where a different perspective begins to emerge. What if the pain, the blindness, the madness, what if all of that is the cost of being filled with something larger than the human condition was ever meant to contain? The Emperor doesn't take to punish. He takes to make room. Room for a fragment of his will, his light, his consciousness. Maybe the agony is what happens when a mortal soul tries to bear a piece of something divine. There's an old belief, buried in the lesser-known liturgies of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, that the Emperor's touch isn't just a mark, it's a gift. They say it's the only way a human being can endure the warp without being swallowed whole. That without soul binding, no psyker would last a heartbeat in the howling chaos of the immaterium. But with it, they become something else. Not fully divine, not fully human, but a hybrid, a vessel, and vessels must be emptied before they can be filled. That's where the paradox comes in. To survive the warp, the soul must change, and change always feels like loss. You don't get to keep your old self, your fears, your limits, your ego. All of that gets burned away. What's left isn't just a husk. It's something new, not better, not worse, just different, reforged. Some fans believe the Emperor gives each Astropath a sliver of his awareness, that in the moment of binding, he looks into them and sees everything they are, and then replaces their small, fragile perspective with a single shining piece of his own. That would explain why so many Astropaths emerge from the ritual with this eerie serenity. Even in their pain, they've seen something bigger than themselves, touched something ancient, infinite, and that changes how you view the galaxy. Others argue that the gift isn't divine insight, but purpose. Before the ritual, many of these psykers were terrified, directionless, even suicidal. Afterward, they know who they are, what they're for. That kind of clarity is rare in the Imperium, where most people die not knowing if their life ever mattered. Astropaths don't have that problem. Their lives mean something. They are vital, trusted, chosen. That kind of certainty? It's a powerful thing. It can carry someone through horrors no ordinary human could endure. There's also a theory, one I kind of love honestly, that soul binding is the Emperor's way of sharing his burden. That by linking himself to thousands of psykers, he's not just using them, he's distributing his pain, spreading it out across souls who can help carry the load. Not because he wants them to suffer, but because he can't do it alone. It turns the whole ritual into something almost intimate. Not domination, but connection. A desperate, dying god reaching out, hand trembling, asking, "Will you help me hold the line?" And if that's true, if the Emperor is giving himself to these people in the only way he can, then maybe we've had it backward all along. Maybe the blindness isn't a punishment. Maybe it's a veil, shielding them from truths too bright for mortal eyes. Maybe the pain is a side effect of becoming more, of becoming something else. There's no clean answer. There never is in this universe. But I think it's worth asking, if the Emperor truly gives part of himself to every Astropath, then what does that make them? Are they slaves or saints? Victims or vessels? Maybe they're all of that at once. Maybe that's the price of touching divinity in a galaxy built on war and decay. You burn. But in that burning, you illuminate. So when we ask what the Emperor takes from every Astropath, maybe the better question is, what does he leave behind? Because in the end, the most terrifying and beautiful truth might be this: he gives them something they can never explain. And in doing so, they become more than human, less than whole, and utterly irreplaceable. After everything we've explored, it becomes almost impossible to look at an Astropath the same way again. They aren't just messengers, they're not just psychic infrastructure for a crumbling empire. They are the unsung martyrs of the Imperium, blind, scarred, and hollowed out, yet still standing between humanity and the abyss. Every whisper they send across the stars is bought with pain. Every connection they forge through the warp is a battle against madness. And behind all of that, behind every hollow socket and trembling breath, is the touch of the Emperor himself. Both a curse and a benediction. The soul binding takes so much. We've seen how it devours identity, strips away physical form, scars the mind, and maybe even carves out pieces of the soul itself. It's a ritual that turns people into conduits, into sacred machines of thought and memory. But in return, maybe, just maybe, it leaves behind something that can't be measured. A fragment of light in the dark. A connection not just to the Emperor, but to something greater than self. Still, that doesn't erase the cost. Every Astropath lives with the knowledge that they've given up who they were so the Imperium can survive a little longer. They don't get the glory of a space marine or the fury of a battle psyker. They aren't remembered with songs or statues. But without them, the galaxy falls silent. Worlds die alone. Armies vanish into the void. They hold the threads that bind the stars, and they do it knowing that no one will ever truly understand what it took from them. And what about the Emperor? Is he a savior offering strength and clarity in exchange for pain? Or is he a god who demands pieces of his servants like a toll paid in hope and humanity? Maybe he's both. Maybe that's the nature of power in the Warhammer universe. No gift without blood, no purpose without suffering. We can debate whether soul binding is a divine communion or a brutal mechanism of control, but in the end, the effect is the same. The Imperium survives, the Astropaths burn, and the galaxy moves on. What strikes me most is that the Astropaths themselves rarely complain. They don't protest. They don't resist. Even those who break do so quietly. There's something eerie and admirable about that kind of submission. Not out of fear, but out of this deep, ingrained belief that their agony matters. That the pain means something. Maybe that's the most terrifying part, that in a galaxy this dark, the only real light left is carried by the blind. So the next time you read about a fleet receiving orders across hundreds of light years, or a planetary governor reacting just in time to stop an invasion, think about the one who made that possible. Think about the Astropath, curled up in some shadowed sanctum, eyes long gone, body cracked from the inside out, whispering messages into the void with the last strength they have. No armor, no weapon, just raw will, burning in silence. In the end, what the Emperor takes from every Astropath is everything they once were, and what he leaves behind is something terrifyingly necessary. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you. This kind of deep dive isn't easy. It pulls you into the uncomfortable questions and forces you to look at the Imperium with less awe and more honesty. But if you're the kind of person who wants to go deeper, who isn't afraid to stare into the shadows of this universe, then you're exactly who I'm making this content for. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because next time we're diving even deeper into the hidden layers of the Imperium, the warp, and the truth that most never want to hear. The Astropath showed us that sometimes silence is louder than words, but we're here to speak what they can't.